Hello and welcome to episode 322 of Hot Media with Bob Mann. Every week on this podcast, we discuss the hottest content and the hottest controversies in mass media. For those of you who are seeing the video version of this podcast, it's primarily an audio podcast, but we certainly do have video. We hope you watch and subscribe to on YouTube. You see in the other box my guest, who is the author of this great book, which was brought to my attention very recently in my other life as a professor of communication and media studies at Caldwell University. And it's called Latino TV, A History. And my guest on the program is Professor Mary Beltran. Mary is Associate Professor of Media Studies and also an affiliate of Mexican American Latino Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. A very, very interesting book, Mary. And in addition, we have to face the reality that people in the Latinx Hispanic community make up almost 20% of the American TV audience, and yet they're pretty underrepresented, I would say.
Absolutely. This is part of why I was interested in beginning to explore the history. I was really curious, particularly to see, how patterns have developed and where things were in the 1950s when we did have shows like The Cisco Kid and I Love Lucy that featured Latino characters, if not Latino stars, aside from Desi Arnaz.
One of the things I wanted to mention was the greatness of Desi Arnaz, which you do recognize in your book, because we did an episode earlier this year about being the Ricardos, and I teach a course called TV Show Genres, and people don't realize Desi Arnaz's power as an executive and also as a television production pioneer. He's the one who created the three-camera live audience sitcom that is used to this very day. He's the first person of Hispanic heritage to be the president of a major media company in the United States. While there are so many people who are left out, Desi Arnaz, facing tremendous prejudice, really did step up and step out. He is an exception, an outlier in all of this history, isn't he?
Absolutely. He also was the first person to think of, because he came up with, the three camera setup, they were able to shoot on film, which basically also allows eventually for us to have reruns and syndication. And so he was an important executive as well as just simply a performer and entertainer. Um, I do, yeah. I would have gone even into more depth on I Love Lucy in the book, but I actually had focused on Desi Arnaz in my earlier book, and I didn't want simply to repeat the same information.
Yeah,
But I
and
do,
I think if you stress it too much, it makes it look like everything's all okay too, which it certainly is not. And talk about Latinx people being in positions of control. People are who are not working in the industry or teach about the industry, studying it, very often say, well, it's who's on camera who matters. And yes, that has to do with representation and imagery, but it's who's behind the camera, the studio executive, the producer, the showrunner. And one of the things you stress in your book is that if, these Latina voices and images are going to be seen and shared, it's not the actors who are going to do it. It's the people behind the scenes for what you call creative agencies. So, talk a little bit about the need for a lot of these Latinx showrunners to really not have to just sell their show, but they also have to sell themselves. And we need to get past that.
yeah. Well, and I'm really glad that you bring this up. I very deliberately wanted to focus in the book on Latino writers and producers, and the fact that they typically, like through much of the history of U.S. television, they have not been there, have not been employed in those positions. So even though we have Desi Arnaz in the 1950s in the role that he had with Desilu Productions, it's really not until the late last years of the 1990s and the early 2000s before we actually have Latino, and then later some Latina writer producers who are leading their own series. But one thing to know, particularly if we look at the 2000s, is that the audience that the networks cared about, was the predominantly white audience, and so shows like George Lopez and Ugly Betty that I look at in one of the chapters, the the networks behind these series really were concerned that these shows appealed to white viewers, and they did have to actually to survive. So we can think about these showrunners needing to balance an interest in serving a Latino audience and a non-Latino audience and please the networks, and then also hopefully please themselves, fulfill their own personal vision for the story that they're telling through the series. So to me, it seems like quite an amazing feat to have a series that would run longer than a season, and so shows like George Lopez and Ugly Betty were very important.
Let's talk a little bit about stereotypes. We don't want the entire book is not just about stereotypes. You're talking a lot about, again, it's a history. You're going all the way back to the golden age of television and up to the present day, including streaming. But let's just talk about stereotypes briefly. One of the nastiest, ugliest stereotypes for Latino actors is to play the drug cartel kingpin. And I mentioned this to you just briefly before we started recording. I am a huge fan of Ozark, and two great Latino actors who have huge resumes and have choices in what they can do. Isai Morales and Felix Solis, who have played a wide variety of people, including cops, play two of the most ruthless drug dealers, and they do it extremely well in Ozark. Isai Morales is Del, and Felix Solis is Omar Navarro, the head of the cartel. But if this whole thing has come up in the Italian American community with mafia movies and TV shows, Sopranos and Godfather, what are your feelings about these roles, about good actors who have choices taking these roles, or is this okay in your opinion if it's just part of a bigger mix?
It's such a great question, and very, I think, a very complicated topic. Unfortunately, I think that Latino and Latina actors still are presented with not a wide range of roles to audition for, and so some of those roles still, I think, are linked to crime, linked to former stereotypes, and so I think that I think some actors are choosing to take on some of those roles while they also really want variety, really want to be able to show their skills, their talent. And so I think sometimes they're taking a role like this, and they want it to be a much more complicated role, a role in which they might be able to, gain more visibility and then have more options, more opportunities based on it. It's a challenge for writers as well, and so in my last chapter, I focus on Latina writer producers who are beginning to really find a lot of success and a lot of opportunities compared to the past. And one of the shows in which we've had two Latina showrunners is Queen of the South, which is a remake of La Reina del Sur, a Spanish language telenovela. And I sensed in interviews that I did that there's some frustration on the part of writers who don't want to keep recreating what we might consider stereotypes, but it's also a big deal to be given the opportunity to be the executive producer of a series, and it can also lead to other things. And so it's a mixed bag. I don't think that anyone I interviewed felt like it was great to have more shows that emphasize Latino criminals. And yet, if it's one of the only shows that features Latino protagonists, it's something that that could be seen as a helpful opportunity that might lead to other kinds of shows like Los Spookies or Vida. Some of these really more unique shows that we're seeing in recent years.
One of the things you mentioned in the book, and I think you made reference to it in our conversation here on Hot Media, is the idea that a show that features Latinos, Latinas, has to have a broader appeal because of the fact you don't want to just have 18.5% of the audience. You want people to be able to relate to that. So, in preparation for this interview, last night I watched Los Spookies. And it's funny. It's really very funny.
Yeah.
Yo hablo español un poquito, so I needed I needed the subtitles, but that's fine. I look at things in subtitles, and
Hmm.
you still get the laughs. It's a hysterical concept, and that is a show. If people know about it, that could appeal to everybody. The idea is just quickly this group of young people, they're really into horror and they're really, into horror movies and that whole thing. And they provide horror for people who need it. For example, a priest who's not as popular in his parish anymore as the young priest needs to perform a phony exorcism, excuse me. And, a show like this does really appeal, and that can be done, can it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it says a lot that that show is on HBO and not HBO Latino. And so I think that there was the awareness that it's simply funny, and the characters they happen to be Latino. It's based in a kind of generic Latin American city, and so we don't even know where it's located. Originally, I think they thought of it as maybe taking place in Mexico City, but these characters are funny misfits and very unique, and the it's just really a kind of absurd horror. It's actually not at all scary, but it's a definitely a genre blend and one of a kind. And I think it shows that there are all kinds of stories, and they don't need to be the typical cliches that we used to see of, you know, people trying to cross the border, and the patriotic story of the American dream. And like there are and certainly the drug lord story. There are a few that have been done over and over again, and I think that the writers, the Latinx writers that are out today, I think they want to tell new stories and not be confined to recreating some of those past narratives that we used to see all the time.
And when we talk about the producers, the showrunners, so I mentioned, of course, Los Spookies, and there are a number of showrunners and show creators who are Latinx people here. And I checked out their IMDb, and they also happen to be performers. There are actors in the series, Ana Fabrega and Julio Torres. But then I watched the credits, and in the end, the executive producer is Lorne Michaels, who anybody who's listening to this podcast knows that Lorne Michaels, of course, is the legendary creator and producer of Saturday Night Live. So does this mean that even somebody who's got a red hot project, a Latino or Latina producer, still needs to go to somebody who's in the mainstream to get this done? Or is this kind of just the way the show business works? Lorne Michaels, SNL, Fred Armisen was one of the creators of the show. Is this less insidious than it might appear, or is it what it appears to be?
Well, I think, unfortunately, that there really are just still so few Latino executives, like very, very few, that are working in the television industry, and certainly at the level of the individuals that are able to greenlight projects. Like we now do have some Latino media industry executives, but they're still at the lower or middle level of management. And so for someone like Fred Armisen, who ended up working with Ana Fabrega and Julio Torres to pitch the project, and he is one of the creative executive producers as well. Like they still needed to have a home within the industry, And so someone like Lorne Michaels is important in this way. And um, a show like Vida, which Tanya Saracho was the executive producer of on Stars, it was extremely important that there was actually a Latina executive, Marta Fernandez, who had convinced the network that they should find a few Latino writer producers and allow multiple people to pitch projects, and that they would produce at least one of them. And that resulted in Vida. And perhaps it's a coincidence, but Marta Fernandez left Stars for another position, and it just turned out that Vida was canceled about a year later. So it really helps to have a patron, to have an executive who cares strongly about your project and would like to see it out, and out in the world. And right now we have very few Latinos who are in that position.
Let's talk just a little bit about the book itself. We're talking about the book Latino TV, A History. Mary Beltran is the author and our guest. Who's the target audience here? Is this a textbook for university media studies programs? Is this a read for a general audience? Mary, who do you see as people who are among the potential audience here?
My hope was that it would reach beyond an academic audience. I certainly wanted it to be able to be read in undergraduate college classes and perhaps in advanced high school classes. And so I worked as we get taught in academia sometimes to write in a lingo that's not very accessible, and so I had to fight against that sometimes. Um, and I also hope that it could be read by my own relatives, and by readers who were not scholars, not part of a college audience. And so I don't know if I always succeeded in that, but I hope that that might be possible.
Well, it is published by New York University Press, and I certainly would recommend it to anybody. Well, this is what I'm looking for in a target audience here after 2.5 years. People who I call, for lack of a better term, media junkies, people who are obsessed with media. We do more journalism than entertainment. But anybody who's really interested in the history of television, this is a huge part of the history of television and the future of television. And as we talk about the future, I'd like to ask you, Mary, if you could just tell us about something you said toward the end of the book, which is that you look to the future with optimism, but you also look to the future with frustration. Please explain that.
Well, I certainly am seeing more nuance in the kinds of stories by and about Latinos that we're seeing in television. And my own students, many of them are going to be moving forward and working in media and working in making television, and they're full of amazing ideas and very different kinds of narratives that we haven't seen before. And um, there's an organization within the TV industry called the Latinx Project, Untitled Latinx Project. And one thing that they're doing is they are sponsoring a kind of competition every year now of pilots that have not been made yet. And so every year they're giving attention to these new up and coming writers. And I'm able to summarize some of the most recent ones in my conclusion chapter, and they're fascinating projects that I would love to see made. And so there's a great energy, and I think there's a lot to look forward to in terms of seeing these new creators of television be able to get their work out there. But on the other hand, we've seen very little progress over time in terms of the numbers of series that feature Latino protagonists. Like, it can feel like, oh, there's 3 new exciting series, but then we'll hear that they're canceled a year or two later, and there isn't. So it always feels a bit like 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. in really seeing more visibility of Latino characters and stories and writers for that matter. So working Latino writer producers are speaking out more and organizing and supporting each other more than ever before. But they've expressed their frustration in an open letter to Hollywood that was published a few years ago, and the demands are the same demands that could have been made 10 years ago or 20 years ago. In fact, I think there was more optimism in the late 90s and early 2000s when we saw such a jump of the first showrunners entering the industry. So it's frustrating. There's still plenty to wish could take place, but I do think, I mean, if nothing else, the growth of the Latino audience to almost now 20% of all American viewers, and also I think the fact that the younger generation is more often looking to English language TV than Spanish language TV is another impetus for the industry to continue to at least try to look more responsive, even if they are not as interested in that programming as perhaps other programming that they're behind.
You
Yeah.
just took the next question right out of my mouth. What role does Spanish language television play in the idea of, well, an audience that's bilingual or Spanish speaking already has, and please forgive my pronunciation, Telemundo and Univision, to provide these programs from all around the Spanish speaking world? Is that something that somehow siphons off some of the Hispanic audience?
It's an important question. I think that um, both Telemundo and Univision, like in some local markets, their programming in the ratings is always in the top five shows of the night before, or even the top three shows of the night before. So certainly in some regions of the country, especially with large Latino populations, Spanish language TV is very competitive with English language TV. But it also is known that younger Latino viewers are very likely to be watching English language television instead of Spanish language television, and or at the very least, the majority of Latinos watch some Spanish language TV and a lot of English language TV. So I think that 20 years ago, I think there's more awareness of that, more awareness that at the level, for English language networks, the executives, I think, are much more aware now that their potential Latino audience is not just jumping over to Spanish language TV. So um, e- every decade, a larger percentage of Latinos are watching more and more English language TV, and that will continue. In fact, younger, second and third generation and fourth generation Latinos may speak only English in their home and only watch English language television. So it will be important to court the Latino audience. Really, if networks want to survive and do well, and especially in this fragmented environment of television, also like a smaller audience is also something that is possible than it used to be. As I'm sure you also know from your work, so a show on Stars can get a smaller audience and still the network can survive.
Yeah, you don't need a 50 share anymore. This is not like the days of the Ed Sullivan Show years ago. I've taken up more of your time than I said I would, but with just a couple of minutes left, if you can just give people in a broader audience an idea of some of the shows which feature Latina actors and are done by Latinx producers, which would have a broad appeal. We talked a lot about Los Spookies, but there are other shows which are in English or in Spanish with English subtitles, which just could certainly interest people beyond the Latinx community. If you could tell everybody about some of those.
Sure. And some of those have been canceled, but are still available, especially if they are streaming. One Day at a Time, the remake of One Day at a Time, I should say. It's still a Norman Lear project, but the co-executive producer is Gloria Calderon Kellett, and it's very funny and a very affectionate look at a three-generation Cuban American family. The eldest is the grandmother, played by Rita Moreno, who has, as I'm sure listeners and viewers know, has such a long history in American film and television. We also have Hintified, about a Mexican American family of cousins and a grandparent in East Los Angeles who are trying to help their taqueria survive in the days of gentrification. On My Block, I mean, these are all Netflix series, which is interesting. On My Block, also about teenagers, high school students who live in South Central LA, and are smart kids dealing with some serious and some comedic situations, and with a really fun cast. They're really, I mean, there are quite a few, although, it's sad to see that these particular shows will not have further seasons. But, hopefully we're going to be seeing more and more new series coming in as well.
It's an absolutely fascinating topic. I never remember to do this because we do the video live to tape and then I edit the audio version. But I would just ask you to hang on just until I wrap up the show so that you and I can
Okay.
actually talk off the air, for lack of a better term. I know we're not in broadcasting. But for those of you who are interested, and I hope you are, it is Latino TV, A History by Mary Beltran. It's from NYU Press. And can you get this on Amazon and other places? On the shelf at Barnes and Noble? Where can you get it?
I know that it's on Amazon, and I have not checked Barnes and Noble. I should check them out, and hopefully it will begin to make its way into some local bookstores as well.
Well, it's going to make its way into one of the courses in my department. So I thank you very much. It's a very, very interesting conversation and a topic that we really should be paying attention to. And I thank you very much, Mary, for being here on Hot Media.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, let me just wrap up the show here very briefly. And for those of you who are listening on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Odyssey, this is primarily an audio based podcast, but we are on YouTube. And if you're listening or you're watching, please subscribe because we talk every week about the hottest issues and the hottest content in the media, mostly mass media. We do both journalism and entertainment, but if you want to know more, there's the website, www.bobmanhotmedia.com. And on that website, you can see all of our archives, find out what's going on with the podcast. Please follow me on Twitter, my handle at Bob Mann Media. And please join us on a regular basis every week as we discuss the hottest issues, the hottest content in mass media. Obviously, we're keeping a tremendous eye on what's going on in Ukraine. And as always, I like to just pay tribute to all of the brave journalists who are risking their lives and risking everything so that we all know the truth and not Putin's propaganda. So please be watching us as we talk about all of this right here on Hot Media. Thank you so much.